When former Confederate nurse Grace Henley fled Georgia to escape her haunting war memories, she never imagined that answering a mail-order bride advertisement would reunite her with the very conflict she was trying to forget. What she discovered was that her supposed groom was actually her former Confederate commander, now a dangerous criminal pursuing her across the frontier. But salvation came from the most unexpected source, a one-armed Union cavalry captain whose own war wounds ran deeper than anyone could see. This is a story of enemies who become lovers of healing that transcends the bitterness of war, and of two broken souls who discover that forgiveness is the strongest foundation for love. When the past collides with the present in the untamed Arizona territory, can love truly conquer the deepest wounds of America's most divisive conflict? If you believe in the power of redemption and the healing grace of true love, you won't want to miss this incredible journey of courage, forgiveness, and hope. Like it and subscribe for more amazing stories of love conquering all. Confederate nurse finds love with Union captain while fighting her criminal former commander. Grace Henley's hands still shook whenever she heard thunder. The sound carried her back to Gettysburg, to Antietam, to all the blood-soaked battlefields where she had worked as a field nurse trying to save boys who were dying too young and too far from home. 3 years after the war's end, the memories remained as fresh and terrible as if the cannons had fallen silent yesterday. Standing on the depot platform in Prescott, Arizona territory, Grace pulled her worn shawl closer against the desert wind and tried to quiet her racing heart. She had come west seeking peace, distance from the ghosts that haunted the South, and perhaps a chance to build a new life far from the devastation of war. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like providence. A rancher seeking a wife with nursing experience, offering a fresh start in a land where the conflict between North and South meant nothing compared to the daily struggle for survival. What she had not expected was to find herself face to face with the very past she was trying to escape. "Miss Henley." The voice was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, carrying the cultured accent of Virginia aristocracy and the unmistakable tone of command. Grace's blood turned to ice as she turned to see Colonel Ezra Blackthorne stepping out of the shadows near the depot, his Confederate gray uniform replaced by expensive civilian clothes, but his predatory smile unchanged from the war years. "Colonel Blackthorne," Grace managed to say, though her voice sounded hollow to her own ears. "What are you doing here?" "Why, I've come to collect my bride, naturally," Blackthorne replied, his pale eyes glittering with the same cruel amusement Grace remembered from the field hospitals where he had commanded absolute obedience. "Surely you didn't think I would allow my most valuable asset to disappear into the frontier without pursuit?" Grace felt the familiar paralysis that had always gripped her in Blackthorne's presence, the learned helplessness of someone who had been broken by months of psychological manipulation and threats. During the war, she had served under his command in the Confederate Medical Corps, and she had learned to fear his soft voice and calculating mind more than any Union artillery barrage. "I don't understand," Grace said, though a terrible suspicion was already forming in her mind. "The advertisement was placed by a rancher seeking a wife with medical experience," Blackthorne finished smoothly. "Yes, my dear Grace, I placed that advertisement specifically to lure you west. Did you really think you could simply disappear from Georgia without my knowledge? Did you imagine that I would allow you to take your specialized skills and vanish into obscurity?" The specialized skills. Grace's hands trembled as she remembered what Blackthorne was referring to. The terrible things he had forced her to do during the final months of the war, the medical procedures that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with extracting information from captured Union soldiers. She had told herself she was saving lives by following orders, but the nightmares that haunted her sleep suggested otherwise. "That was the war, Colonel," Grace said, trying to find some fragment of the courage that had once made her volunteer for the most dangerous field hospitals. "The war is over." "For some, perhaps," Blackthorne replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. "But for others, the war simply moved to new battlefields. I have established quite a profitable enterprise here in the territory, Grace, and I find myself in need of someone with your particular talents." Grace looked around the bustling depot, hoping to see some avenue of escape, some authority figure who might intervene. But this was the frontier where men settled their own disputes and women had few protections beyond what they could provide for themselves. "I won't do it again," Grace said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Whatever enterprise you've built, whatever you want from me, I won't be part of it. Blackthorn's expression darkened with the first hint of the volcanic temper Grace remembered from the war. My dear Grace, I fear you misunderstand your situation. You are here because I summoned you. You will serve because I command it. The alternatives to cooperation are quite unpleasant, I assure you. Hey there, miss. A new voice interrupted Blackthorn's threats, and Grace turned to see a man approaching from the direction of the freight wagons. He was tall and lean-dressed in the practical clothes of a working rancher with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. What caught Grace's attention immediately was his left sleeve pinned up at the elbow where his arm should have been. Is this gentleman bothering you? The stranger asked, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. When he turned slightly, Grace caught sight of his profile and felt her breath catch in recognition. Captain James Sullivan. Storm Sullivan, they had called him in the Union cavalry for his habit of striking like lightning and vanishing before the enemy could respond. Grace had seen him only once during the war, when he had been brought to her field hospital as a prisoner after a failed raid behind Confederate lines. She had treated his wounded arm, the same arm that was now missing entirely, and had been struck by his quiet dignity even in captivity. Captain Sullivan, Blackthorn said with cold recognition. How unexpected. Still playing the gallant protector, I see. Still terrorizing women who can't fight back, I see, Sullivan replied evenly, though Grace noticed his right hand drift closer to the gun on his hip. Some things never change. Grace found herself caught between two men whose mutual hatred was as obvious as it was dangerous. Whatever history lay between them, it was clear that their war had not ended at Appomattox. Miss Sullivan said, addressing Grace directly while keeping his eyes on Blackthorn, I believe you were expecting to meet someone about a ranching position. If this gentleman isn't who you were looking for, I'd be happy to escort you to safety. Grace looked into Sullivan's storm-gray eyes and saw something she had almost forgotten existed. Genuine concern without ulterior motive, strength offered in protection rather than dominance. Yes, she said, making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. Yes, I believe you're the person I came to meet. Blackthorn's face flushed with rage at Grace's obvious rejection of his authority. This is not over, Grace. You belong to me, and I will have what is mine. The lady has made her choice, Sullivan said quietly, but there was steel beneath his calm words. I suggest you respect it. Captain Blackthorn said with a smile that promised retribution, you always did have a weakness for lost causes. I wonder if you'll find this one worth dying for. As Blackthorn melted back into the crowd of travelers and townspeople, Grace felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her. She had escaped Blackthorn's immediate control, but she knew enough about her former commander to realize that he would not simply accept defeat and disappear. Whatever game he was playing, her refusal to cooperate had only raised the stakes. Miss Henley, isn't it? Sullivan said gently, drawing Grace's attention back to her immediate circumstances. I'm James Sullivan. Most folks call me Storm. I heard you were looking for employment, and I might be able to help. Grace studied his face, noting the lines of pain and weariness that marked a man who had seen too much and suffered more than his share. Mr. Sullivan, I should tell you that I'm not actually looking for marriage. I answered an advertisement under false pretenses, and now I find myself in a difficult situation. I gathered as much, Sullivan replied with what might have been the ghost of a smile. And I should tell you that I'm not actually looking for a wife, but I am looking for someone with medical training to help with my ranch hands and the folks in the area who can't afford a real doctor. Grace felt a flutter of hope at his words. Honest work using her healing skills rather than the terrible knowledge Blackthorn had forced her to acquire. It sounded almost too good to be true. What kind of ranch? Grace asked as Sullivan led her toward a wagon loaded with supplies. Cattle mostly, some horses. I've got about a dozen men working for me, and we're always dealing with injuries from the work. Broken bones, cuts, horse kicks, the usual hazards of frontier life. Having someone who knows how to set bones and stitch wounds properly would be a godsend. As they walked through the busy streets of Prescott, Grace found herself studying James Sullivan with professional interest. His missing arm was clearly a war wound, probably amputation performed under battlefield conditions. The way he moved suggested other injuries as well. A slight limp that spoke of an old leg wound, a tendency to favor his right side that indicated possible rib damage. But what struck her most was his obvious discomfort in the crowded town. Sullivan's eyes constantly scanned the streets, his body remained tense despite his calm manner, and she noticed how he positioned himself to keep walls at his back whenever possible. These were the signs of someone who had learned not to trust peace, who expected violence to erupt without warning. Grace recognized the symptoms because she shared them. "Mr. Sullivan," Grace said as they reached his wagon, "may I ask you a personal question?" "Depends on the question," Sullivan replied, though his tone remained friendly. "Do you have nightmares about the war?" Sullivan's hand stilled on the wagon's tailgate, and for a moment Grace thought she had overstepped proper boundaries. Then he turned to look at her with eyes that held understanding and relief in equal measure. "Every night," Sullivan admitted. "Thunder, gunfire, sudden noises. They all take me back to places I'd rather forget." "Do you "Every night," Grace echoed. "I keep thinking that time and distance will make it better, but the ghosts follow wherever we go," Sullivan finished. "Yeah, I know that feeling." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two veterans of different armies finding common ground in shared trauma. Grace felt something ease in her chest, a tension she had carried for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to let it go. "So," Sullivan said finally, "would you be interested in the position? The pay isn't much, but it includes room and board, and the work is honest. Mostly it would be patching up cowboys and maybe helping with difficult births, cattle and human both." Grace thought about the alternatives facing her: returning to Georgia and the ghost that haunted every corner of the defeated South, or remaining in Arizona territory where Blackthorn was obviously establishing some kind of criminal operation. Neither option offered much hope for peace or healing. Mr. Sullivan, to Grace, said, "I think I would like that very much." The Sullivan Ranch was everything Grace had hoped for, and more. Located in a broad valley surrounded by red rock formations that glowed like jewels in the desert sunset, it offered the kind of stunning natural beauty that made human conflicts seem small and temporary. The ranch house was modest but comfortable, built of local stone and timber, with wide porches that invited contemplation of the magnificent landscape. What impressed Grace most, however, was the obvious respect and affection the ranch hands showed for their employer. These were hard men, the kind of frontier survivors who typically trusted no one, but they treated James Sullivan with the loyalty usually reserved for proven leaders. When Sullivan introduced Grace as the new ranch medic, they welcomed her with the same courtesy they showed their boss. "Ma'am," said the ranch foreman, a grizzled veteran named Tobias Freeman, whose dark skin and careful manner suggested his own complex relationship with the recent war. "We're mighty glad to have you here. Storm's done his best, patching us up when we get hurt, but having someone who actually knows what they're doing will be a blessing." Grace noticed the way Tobias called Sullivan Storm, with the casual familiarity of long friendship, and she wondered about the relationship between the white ranch owner and his black foreman. Such partnerships were rare in the post-war South, where old hatreds died hard and social boundaries remained rigidly enforced. "Tobias and I served together," Sullivan explained as if reading her thoughts. "He saved my life more times than I can count, and when the war ended, we decided to head west and build something together." The simple statement spoke volumes about both men's character. Sullivan had chosen loyalty and friendship over social convention, while Tobias had chosen to tie his fate to a man he trusted rather than strike out completely on his own. "Mr. Freeman," Grace said formally, "I look forward to working with you. If anyone is injured, please don't hesitate to call on me regardless of the hour." "Just Tobias, ma'am," the foreman replied with a smile that transformed his weathered features. "And I have a feeling we're going to get along just fine." That evening, as Grace settled into the small but comfortable room Sullivan had prepared for her, she reflected on the dramatic changes the day had brought. This morning she had been a desperate woman fleeing her past, trapped between unwelcome alternatives and facing a future that held only fear and uncertainty. Tonight she was employed in honest work, surrounded by people who seemed to value her skills and protected by a man whose own wounds made him understanding of others' pain. It felt too good to be true, and Grace's experience had taught her to be suspicious of unexpected good fortune. Her wariness proved justified 2 days later when she discovered exactly what kind of enterprise Colonel Blackthorn had established in Arizona territory. Grace was returning from treating a ranch hand's broken collarbone when she saw the riders approaching from the south. A dozen men in military formation, their leader unmistakably Ezra Blackthorne, despite the civilian clothes. They rode with the precision of cavalry troopers, but there was something predatory in their approach that made Grace's blood run cold. "Storm," she called out as she ran toward the ranch house. "Sullivan, they're coming." Sullivan emerged from the barn with Tobias and several other ranch hands, his expression grim but unsurprised. "How many?" he asked, his voice calm despite the obvious danger. "A dozen, maybe more," Grace replied, trying to control her breathing. "Blackthorn's leading them." Sullivan nodded grimly and began issuing orders with the efficiency of a military commander. "Tobias, get the extra rifles from the house. Miguel, take 3 men and circle around to the north ridge. If this goes bad, we'll need covering fire. Everyone else, defensive positions behind the corrals." "What does he want?" asked one of the younger hands, a boy barely out of his teens, who had obviously never faced organized violence. "He wants Miss Grace," Sullivan replied bluntly, "and he's willing to kill anyone who gets in his way to take her." Grace felt guilt and terror wash over her in equal measure. "This is my fault," she said. "I should draw him away from here before anyone gets hurt." "No," Sullivan said with quiet finality. "Running from men like Blackthorne just encourages them. Sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to make the cost of predation too high to bear." As Blackthorne's riders drew closer, Grace found herself remembering the stories she had heard about Captain Storm Sullivan during the war. The Union cavalry officer who struck without warning and vanished before retaliation, who had terrorized Confederate supply lines and rescued dozens of captured soldiers from behind enemy lines. Looking at him now preparing to defend his ranch with the same tactical precision he had once used against her own army, Grace began to understand why Blackthorne feared him enough to bring overwhelming force to their confrontation. "Grace," Blackthorne called out, as his riders formed a line within shouting distance of the ranch buildings. "I've come to escort you to your new position. There's no need for unpleasantness if you come willingly." "She's not going anywhere, Colonel," Sullivan replied, his voice carrying clearly across the open ground between them. "Miss Henley is under my protection now." Blackthorne's laugh was as cold as winter wind. "Your protection, Captain, like the protection you gave your cavalry regiment at Cedar Creek. How many men died because of your tactical brilliance that day?" Grace saw Sullivan flinch as if struck, and she realized that Blackthorne was attacking old wounds that had never properly healed. Whatever had happened at Cedar Creek, it was clearly a source of guilt and self-doubt that Sullivan had carried since the war. "The past is past, Blackthorne," Sullivan said, though Grace could hear the pain beneath his steady words. "What matters now is that you're outnumbered and outgunned on my property. I suggest you ride away while you still can." Outnumbered, Blackthorne's smile was predatory as he gestured to his mounted raiders. "I count 12 men under my command, Captain." "How many do you have?" 8, 10, bomb. "Enough," Sullivan replied simply. It was then that Grace noticed the movement in the rocks above the valley floor. Sullivan's men weren't all positioned around the ranch buildings. Some of them had taken positions in the surrounding heights, creating a crossfire that would devastate any attacking force. Blackthorne's numerical advantage was meaningless if his men could be caught in the open between converging fields of fire. "You always were clever, Sullivan," Blackthorne admitted, though his tone suggested admiration rather than defeat. "But cleverness only goes so far. Sooner or later, you'll have to drop your guard. And when you do, I'll be waiting." "And then we understand each other," Sullivan replied. "But I should mention that I'm not the only one watching. The territorial marshal has been very interested in reports of Confederate raiders operating in this area. I imagine he'd be fascinated to learn that Colonel Ezra Blackthorne is alive and active in Arizona territory." For the first time since Grace had known him, Blackthorne looked genuinely concerned. "You're bluffing, Captain." "Am I?" Sullivan asked. "Care to test that theory?" The standoff stretched for long minutes, two veteran commanders weighing their options and calculating odds. Finally, Blackthorne raised his hand in a gesture that pulled his riders back from immediate confrontation. "This isn't over, Sullivan," Blackthorne called out as his men began to withdraw. "I will have what belongs to me." "Nothing here belongs to you," Sullivan replied. "And if you come back, I'll be ready." As Blackthorne's raiders disappeared into the desert landscape, Grace felt her legs give out with relief and delayed terror. Sullivan was beside her immediately, his strong right arm supporting her weight as she fought off a wave of dizziness. "It's all right," Sullivan said gently. "He's gone for now." "But he'll be back," Grace said, voicing the fear that gripped her heart. You don't know Blackthorn like I do. He never gives up, never forgives, never stops pursuing what he wants. Sullivan helped her to a chair on the ranch house porch, then knelt beside her so they were at eye level. Grace, tell me what hold he has over you. What did he make you do during the war that gives him such power over your life? Grace closed her eyes, trying to find the courage to speak of things she had never told another soul. He forced me to interrogate captured Union soldiers, using medical procedures to inflict pain to extract information. He said it was necessary for the war effort, that I was saving Confederate lives by breaking enemy resistance. She opened her eyes and saw not the revulsion and condemnation she expected, but understanding and compassion in Sullivan's weathered features. How many? Sullivan asked quietly. I don't know, Grace whispered. Dozens, maybe. I told myself I was following orders, that I had no choice. But the nightmares, the way they screamed. Sullivan's hand covered hers, warm and steady, and surprisingly gentle for such a scarred veteran. Grace, listen to me. War makes monsters of good people. It forces impossible choices and breaks things that can't always be mended. But the war is over, and you get to choose who you are now. Blackthorn says I belong to him, that my skills make me valuable to his operation. Blackthorn is wrong, Sullivan said firmly. You belong to yourself, and your skills can be used for healing instead of harm, for building instead of destroying. Grace felt tears streaming down her face as Sullivan's words penetrated the wall of guilt and shame she had built around her heart. For 3 years, she had believed that her wartime actions had damned her beyond redemption, that she was forever marked by the terrible things she had been forced to do. But looking into Storm Sullivan's understanding eyes, she began to hope that forgiveness might be possible, not just from others, but from herself. Will you help me? Grace asked, her voice small but determined. Will you help me learn to use my hands for healing again instead of harm? Sullivan's smile was gentle and full of promise. Grace Henley, I think helping each other heal might be exactly what we both need. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace felt something she had not experienced since before the war began. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone with no alternatives, but the genuine hope of someone who had found unexpected allies in the fight for redemption. She did not yet know that her greatest trials lay ahead, or that Blackthorn's retreat was merely a tactical withdrawal before a larger assault. She did not know that her growing feelings for James Sullivan would be tested by revelations about their shared past that neither of them suspected. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she was not facing her demons alone. And perhaps with Storm Sullivan's help, she could finally lay those demons to rest. 3 weeks after Blackthorn's first visit, Grace had begun to believe that perhaps her former commander had finally accepted defeat and moved on to easier prey. The ranch had settled into a peaceful routine, with Grace tending to the various injuries and ailments that were part of frontier life, while slowly learning to trust in her own capacity for healing rather than harm. Her relationship with James Sullivan had deepened into something that neither of them quite dared to name, but which showed itself in countless small gestures of care and understanding. Sullivan had taken to joining her for evening walks around the ranch, their conversations ranging from practical matters of ranch management to deeper discussions about healing from the trauma that war had inflicted on their souls. Tell me about Cedar Creek, Grace said one evening as they sat on the ranch house porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. She had noticed how Sullivan's face darkened whenever Blackthorn's taunt was mentioned, and she sensed that whatever had happened there was connected to the guilt and self-doubt that sometimes clouded his storm-gray eyes. Sullivan was quiet for so long that Grace began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain and carefully controlled emotion. It was supposed to be a simple raid, Sullivan began. Intelligence reports suggested a Confederate supply depot with minimal guards. Easy target, quick strikes, significant damage to enemy logistics. I volunteered my cavalry regiment for the mission. Grace remained silent, sensing that Sullivan needed to tell this story in his own way and time. What we found wasn't a lightly guarded supply depot, Sullivan continued. It was a trap. Blackthorn had fed false intelligence to Union spies, using captured soldiers to plant information that would draw us into an ambush. Grace felt her blood chill as she began to understand the connection between Blackthorn's wartime activities and Sullivan's obvious guilt about Cedar Creek. "How many men did you lose?" Grace asked gently. 43. Sullivan replied, the number falling from his lips like a stone into still water. 43 good men who trusted my judgment, who followed my orders into what turned out to be a killing ground. Blackthorn's forces were hidden in the hills around the depot, waiting for us to commit to the attack before opening fire. "That's not your fault," Grace said firmly. "You couldn't have known it was a trap." "Couldn't I?" Sullivan's voice carried the bitter self-recrimination of someone who had replayed the same scenario thousands of times, searching for the mistake that had cost so many lives. "There were signs, Grace. Little things that didn't quite add up, details that should have made me more cautious. But I was eager for glory, confident in my own tactical brilliance. I led my men into slaughter because I was too arrogant to see the obvious trap." Grace moved closer to Sullivan on the porch bench, taking his hand in both of hers. "James, listen to me. War is full of impossible decisions and incomplete information. You made the best choice you could with what you knew at the time." "Did I?" Sullivan asked, turning to look at her with eyes full of anguish. "Or did I make the choice that fed my ego and ambition? How many of those men died because I wanted to be the hero of another brilliant cavalry raid?" Grace saw in Sullivan's face the same self-condemnation that had haunted her own reflection for 3 years. Both of them were carrying guilt for actions taken during the madness of war. Both were struggling to forgive themselves for choices made under impossible circumstances. "James," Grace said softly, "do you think I'm a monster for what I did during the war?" Sullivan's response was immediate and emphatic. "Of course not. You were following orders under threat, trying to save lives in the only way you knew how. You had no real choice in what you were forced to do. Then why do you think you're a monster for following orders and trying to strike a blow against the enemy? Why do you hold yourself to a standard of perfection that you wouldn't expect from anyone else?" Sullivan stared at her for a long moment, and Grace could see her words penetrating the armor of guilt he had built around his heart. I never thought of it that way. We're both carrying wounds that have nothing to do with bullets or blades." Grace said, her voice gentle but certain. "Maybe it's time we helped each other heal from those wounds too." Their first kiss was tentative and sweet, full of the careful hope of two people who had almost given up on the possibility of love and happiness. When they separated, both were crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finding someone who truly understood the burden they carried. "Grace," Sullivan whispered, I think I'm falling in love with you." "I think I've already fallen," Grace replied, then laughed through her tears at the wonder and joy in his expression. Their moment of happiness was shattered by the sound of gunfire erupting from the direction of the ranch's outer buildings. Sullivan was on his feet immediately, his military instincts taking over as he assessed the situation with practiced efficiency. "Stay here," Sullivan ordered as he moved toward the gun rack inside the house. "If anyone comes who isn't one of our people, shoot first and ask questions later." But Grace had not survived the war by cowering in safety while others faced danger. "I'm coming with you. If there are wounded, you'll need medical help." Sullivan's expression showed he wanted to argue, but the sound of more gunfire and shouting men made further discussion pointless. "Stay behind me and do exactly what I say," he ordered grimly. They made their way toward the sound of battle, moving carefully through the darkness toward what appeared to be an attack on the ranch's horse corrals. As they drew closer, Grace could see muzzle flashes and hear the distinctive crack of rifles punctuated by the shouts of men in combat. "Blackthorn," Sullivan said grimly as they took cover behind a stone wall. "He's making his move." Grace peered over the wall and felt her heart sink at what she saw. Blackthorn's raiders had attacked the ranch's night guards using the cover of darkness to get close before opening fire. Several of Sullivan's men were pinned down behind the corrals, their return fire sporadic and largely ineffective against an enemy they couldn't clearly see. "Miguel's down," Sullivan reported after scanning the battlefield with experienced eyes. "Tobias and the others are trapped in the open. If we don't do something soon, they'll be overrun." Grace could see the tactical problem even with her limited military knowledge. Sullivan's men were caught in an exposed position while Blackthorn's raiders held the high ground and numerical advantage. Without support, the defenders would be systematically eliminated. "What can we do?" Grace asked, though she dreaded the answer. Sullivan's smile was grim but determined. "We even the odds." What followed was a display of tactical brilliance that reminded Grace why Captain Storm Sullivan had been one of the Union Army's most effective cavalry commanders. Using hand signals and whispered orders, Sullivan coordinated a counterattack that transformed the defensive battle into an aggressive assault on Blackthorn's positions. Grace found herself pressed into service as both field medic and ammunition courier, crawling through the darkness to reach wounded ranch hands, while Sullivan and Tobias organized the defensive response. The experience was terrifyingly familiar. The controlled chaos of combat, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the desperate urgency of trying to save lives while violence raged around her. But this time was different. This time Grace was using her medical skills to heal, rather than harm, to save the lives of good men, rather than extract secrets from captured enemies. For the first time since the war ended, she felt that her knowledge and abilities were being used for genuinely righteous purposes. "Grace," Sullivan's voice carried over the sounds of battle. "Miguel's hit bad. Can you get to him?" Grace looked toward the fallen ranch hand and saw that he was lying in the open between the opposing forces exposed to fire from both sides. Reaching him would require crossing 20 yards of open ground under the guns of Blackthorn's raiders. "Cover me," Grace said, making the decision before fear could paralyze her judgment. "Grace, no," Sullivan called out, but she was already moving, running in a low crouch toward the wounded man with her medical bag clutched in one hand. The next few minutes were the longest of Grace's life. Bullets whistled around her as she reached Miguel and began assessing his injuries, her hands working automatically while her mind focused on the familiar routine of battlefield medicine. The young ranch hand had taken a bullet in the chest, dangerously close to vital organs, and was losing blood at an alarming rate. "Miguel, stay with me," Grace commanded as she worked to stabilize his condition. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay conscious." "Miss Grace," Miguel gasped, his voice weak but determined. "There's something you need to know about storming the war, about what really happened at Cedar Creek." Grace paused in her work, sensing that Miguel was about to reveal something important. "What about Cedar Creek?" "I was there," Miguel continued, his words coming in short gasps. "Confederate prisoner held in that camp Blackthorn was using as bait. Storm didn't lead his men into a trap by accident. He came for us. 43 prisoners of war that Blackthorn was going to execute as an example." Grace's hands stilled as the implications of Miguel's revelation sank in. "You mean, Storm knew it was a trap," Miguel confirmed. "Knew he was outnumbered, knew most of his men wouldn't make it out alive. But he also knew that if he didn't try 43, prisoners would die for certain. He chose to save lives at the cost of his own men's lives." Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she understood the true weight of guilt that James Sullivan had been carrying. He hadn't lost his men through arrogance or tactical error. He had sacrificed them in a desperate attempt to save prisoner of war lives, including that of the young man who now lay wounded in her arms. "Does he know you remember?" Grace asked as she resumed her medical work, fighting to save the life of someone who might be the key to healing Sullivan's wounded soul. "Never told him," Miguel replied. "Figured he had enough ghosts without me adding to them. But you should know, your man ain't no glory-seeking fool. He's a hero who's been punishing himself for doing the right thing." The sound of approaching footsteps made Grace look up to see Blackthorn himself emerging from the darknesses, his gun trained on her and the wounded ranch hand. The battle had apparently ended while she was focused on Miguel's injuries, though Grace couldn't tell which side had prevailed. "My dear Grace," Blackthorn said with his characteristic cold smile, "how touching to see you practicing your healing arts once again. I must admit I had begun to worry that your experiences during the war had permanently damaged your ability to function as a physician." Grace slowly stood to face her former commander, placing herself between Blackthorn and the wounded Miguel. "Where is Sullivan? Where are his men?" "Scattered or dead, I should think," Blackthorn replied casually. "Your gallant captain put up quite a fight, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Such a pity. He might have lived if he had simply turned you over as I requested." Grace felt a surge of grief and rage at Blackthorn's words. The thought that James Sullivan, good honorable damaged James Sullivan, might be dead because of her was almost unbearable. "I won't go with you," Grace said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I'll die first." "Oh, my dear, you misunderstand," Blackthorn said with genuine amusement. "I have no intention of killing you. Your skills are far too valuable for such waste. But I will kill everyone else in this territory until you agree to cooperate, starting with the wounded boy at your feet." Blackthorn raised his gun toward Miguel, and Grace realized that she was about to watch him murder a helpless man in cold blood. The same helpless feeling that had paralyzed her during the war began to creep over her consciousness, the learned helplessness of someone who had been broken by months of psychological manipulation. But then she remembered Sullivan's words, "You get to choose who you are now." Grace Henley had been a victim during the war, forced to participate in atrocities through threat and coercion. But Grace Henley no longer had to be a victim. She could choose to fight, to resist, to stand up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. "Colonel," Grace said quietly, "there's something you should know." "And what is that, my dear?" "I'm not the same frightened girl you terrorized during the war. I've learned to fight back." Grace's hand found the scalpel in her medical bag, and before Blackthorn could react, she had the blade pressed against his throat. Years of surgical training had given her steady hands and precise movements, and she used both now to immobilize the man who had haunted her nightmares for 3 years. "Drop the gun," Grace ordered, her voice carrying an authority she had never possessed during their previous encounters. "Grace," Blackthorn said with what sounded like genuine surprise, "I'm impressed. Perhaps there's more of your father's steel in you than I realized." "You knew my father?" Grace asked, though she kept the scalpel steady against Blackthorn's throat. "Captain William Henley, Confederate States Navy," Blackthorn confirmed. "He died at Mobile Bay fighting to the end against impossible odds. I always wondered if his daughter had inherited his courage along with his medical knowledge." Grace felt a shock of recognition as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly fell into place. "You targeted me specifically because of who my father was. Your father cost me a great deal during the war, Grace. Ships I couldn't sink, supplies I couldn't intercept, intelligence networks I couldn't penetrate. When I learned that William Henley's daughter possessed advanced medical training, I saw an opportunity for poetic justice. The revelation that her wartime suffering had been personal revenge rather than military necessity filled Grace with a rage that burned away the last of her fear and self-doubt. Blackthorn hadn't forced her to participate in torture because her skills were needed for the war effort. He had done it to hurt and corrupt the daughter of a man he hated. "You destroyed my life for revenge," Grace said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. "I made you useful," Blackthorn corrected. "Your father was a hero who died for his cause. You became a survivor who learned to do what was necessary. Which legacy is more valuable in our current world?" "Drop the gun," Grace repeated, pressing the scalpel deeper against Blackthorn's throat. "Now." The sound of approaching riders made both Grace and Blackthorn look toward the main trail, where a new group of mounted men was approaching the ranch. Grace's heart sank as she realized that Blackthorn's reinforcements had arrived, making her small victory meaningless against overwhelming odds. But as the riders drew closer, Grace saw that the leader was James Sullivan, wounded but alive, flanked by Tobias and several other ranch hands who were supposed to be dead. Behind them rode a group of men wearing the badges of territorial marshals, their weapons drawn, and their intent clearly hostile toward Blackthorn rather than the ranch defenders. "Colonel Ezra Blackthorn," the lead marshal called out as the group drew near. "You're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and operating a criminal enterprise in territorial jurisdiction." Blackthorn's confident smile faltered for the first time since Grace had known him. "On whose authority?" he demanded. "On the authority of the United States territorial government," the marshal replied. "Acting on information provided by Captain James Sullivan and corroborated by multiple witnesses who have come forward to testify about your activities." Grace saw understanding dawn in Blackthorn's eyes as he realized the true scope of Sullivan's tactical planning. The ranch battle had not been a desperate last stand, but a carefully orchestrated trap designed to draw Blackthorn into the open where he could be captured by legitimate authorities. "You planned this," Blackthorn said to Sullivan, with something approaching admiration. "The whole thing was a setup to bring me within reach of federal justice. Sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to make him think he's cornering easy prey," Sullivan replied. "You taught me that at Cedar Creek, Colonel. I just turned your own lesson against you." As the federal marshals took Blackthorn into custody, Grace finally allowed herself to release the breath she had been holding. The nightmare that had haunted her since the end of the war was finally over. Ezra Blackthorne would face justice for his crimes, and she would be free to build a new life without the constant fear of his pursuit. Grace, Sullivan said as he dismounted from his horse and moved to kneel beside the wounded Miguel. "Are you hurt?" "No," Grace replied, though she was shaking with reaction to everything that had happened. "But Miguel needs immediate medical attention. The bullet is still in his chest, and I'll need proper surgical conditions to remove it safely." "Then let's get him to the house," Sullivan said, lifting Miguel carefully in his one good arm, while Grace gathered her medical supplies. As they made their way back to the ranch house, Grace found herself thinking about Miguel's revelation concerning Cedar Creek and the true nature of Sullivan's wartime sacrifice. She understood now why he carried such guilt about the loss of his men, and she knew that healing his emotional wounds would require him to understand that his choice had been heroic rather than foolish. But that conversation would have to wait. Right now, she had a life to save, and for the first time in years, that felt like exactly the right thing to be doing. The surgery to remove the bullet from Miguel's chest took 3 hours and tested every skill Grace had acquired during her years of medical training. Working by lamplight in the ranch house kitchen with Sullivan assisting, and Tobias maintaining sterile conditions as best he could, Grace fought to save the life of the young man who might hold the key to her beloved's redemption. "Easy, Miguel," Grace murmured as she worked to extract the bullet without damaging vital organs. "You're going to be fine. Just a little longer." "Miss Grace," Miguel gasped through the pain. "Did you tell Storm about Cedar Creek? About what really happened?" "Not yet," Grace replied, her attention focused on the delicate work of repairing damaged tissue. "But I will. He needs to know the truth about what kind of man he really is." "Good," Miguel said with satisfaction. "Storm saved my life that day. Time somebody returned the favor by saving his soul." As Grace worked to stitch the wounds and ensure Miguel's survival, she thought about the circular nature of healing and redemption. Miguel had been saved by Sullivan's sacrifice during the war, and now Grace was saving Miguel's life in the present. Soon Miguel's testimony would help save Sullivan from the guilt that had been slowly destroying him from within. It was Grace reflected exactly the kind of interconnected healing that the world needed after the devastating wounds of civil war. People helping each other overcome trauma, survivors supporting other survivors, former enemies learning to see their shared humanity rather than their past differences. "There," Grace said finally as she completed the last suture. "The bleeding has stopped and there doesn't appear to be any organ damage. Miguel should make a full recovery with proper rest and care." Sullivan's smile was radiant with relief and admiration. "Grace, you're amazing. I don't think any of us realize just how skilled a physician you really are." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at Sullivan's praise, but more importantly, she felt the satisfaction of using her abilities for pure healing rather than harm. "James, there's something Miguel told me during the battle, something about Cedar Creek that you need to hear." Sullivan's expression grew wary, but he nodded for her to continue. "What about Cedar Creek?" Grace took Sullivan's hand and led him away from Miguel's bedside to where they could speak privately. "Miguel was there, James. He was one of the prisoners in Blackthorne's camp." Sullivan's face went pale as he began to understand the implications of Grace's words. "You mean, you didn't lead your men into a trap through arrogance or poor judgment," Grace said firmly. "You knew it was a trap, knew you were outnumbered, knew most of your men wouldn't survive. But you also knew that if you didn't act, 43 prisoners of war would be executed. You sacrificed your cavalry to save those prisoners' lives." Sullivan stared at her in shocked tears beginning to stream down his weathered cheeks. "Miguel told you that he remembers everything, James. He's been carrying the knowledge of your sacrifice for 3 years, just like you've been carrying the guilt. But your guilt is misplaced. What you did was the most heroic thing imaginable." Sullivan sank into a chair as the weight of 3 years' worth of self-condemnation began to lift from his shoulders. I always thought I had let my ego override my judgment, that good men died because I wanted glory more than I wanted victory. Good men died because you chose to save the lives of helpless prisoners rather than preserve your own military reputation," Grace corrected gently. "They died for the most honorable cause imaginable, to prevent the murder of captured enemies who deserved protection under the laws of war." Sullivan's tears came freely now, not from grief, but from the overwhelming relief of finally understanding that his actions had been heroic rather than foolish. Grace, how can you forgive me for the things I did during the war? How can you love someone who led 43 men to their deaths? Grace knelt beside Sullivan's chair and took his scarred hands in both of hers. James Sullivan, I can love you because you led 43 men to their deaths in order to save 43 other men's lives. I can love you because when faced with an impossible choice, you chose compassion over self-preservation. I can love you because you're the kind of man who would sacrifice everything for principle. Their embrace was fierce and desperate, two broken people finding healing in each other's arms after years of carrying burdens too heavy for any one person to bear. When they finally separated, both were transformed by the truth that had finally been spoken. So, Sullivan said with a smile that was free from shadows for the first time since Grace had known him, what happens now? Blackthorn is in custody. Miguel is going to recover, and we both know the truth about our wartime experiences. Where does that leave us? Grace looked around the ranch house kitchen where she had just performed life-saving surgery, then out the window at the magnificent Arizona landscape that had become her home. It leaves us free to choose our future without the past dictating our decisions. It leaves us free to build something beautiful together. Are you proposing to me, Miss Henley? Sullivan asked with mock formality. I'm proposing that we stop letting the war define who we are and start letting our love define who we're becoming, Grace replied seriously. I'm proposing that we help each other heal completely and then spend the rest of our lives helping others do the same. Sullivan's kiss was her answer, passionate and joyful and full of promise, for a future neither of them had dared to hope was possible. Outside the Arizona dawn was breaking over the Red Rock Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to symbolize the new beginning that Grace and James had found in each other's love. The war was finally over in their hearts as well as in history, and the future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility. 6 months after Ezra Blackthorn's capture and trial, Grace stood in the doorway of what would soon become the Arizona Territory's first integrated medical clinic, watching James Sullivan and Tobias Freeman work together to install the final window frames in the building they had constructed with their own hands. The clinic represented everything Grace had come to love about her new life in the West. Practical idealism, cooperative effort across racial lines, and the determination to build something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Located halfway between the Sullivan Ranch and the territorial capital, the clinic would serve anyone who needed medical care, regardless of their ability to pay or the color of their skin. Miss Grace, called a familiar voice from behind her, and Grace turned to see Miguel approaching with the careful gait of someone still recovering from serious injury. The supply wagon from Denver just arrived. Want me to help you inventory the medical equipment? Of course, Grace replied with a smile that reflected her deep affection for the young man whose survival had marked the beginning of so many healings. But you're supposed to be taking it easy for another month. Doctor's orders. Miguel grinned, his expression bright with the confidence of someone who had discovered his own worth and place in the world. Doctor's orders from who? You're the only doctor for 50 miles and you're the one telling me to take it easy. Grace laughed, delighting in the easy camaraderie that had developed among the extended family of people who had survived Blackthorn's assault and chosen to build something positive from their shared experience. The ranch had become a refuge for others seeking to escape the lingering hatreds and divisions of the post-war period, and Grace had found herself serving as unofficial counselor to people struggling with their own war-related trauma. Grace, James called from inside the clinic. You might want to come see this. Tobias found something interesting in the supply shipment. Grace made her way into the clinic's main treatment room, marveling as always at the clean, well-organized space that would soon be serving patients from across the territory. What she found was Tobias and James examining a letter that had been included with the medical supplies, their expressions suggesting it contained significant news. What is it? Grace asked, moving to read over James's shoulder. Official notification from the territorial government, James replied, holding up the document so Grace could see the official seal in formal language. They're offering you a commission as the territorial medical inspector with authority to establish standards for medical care and oversee the training of frontier physicians. Grace stared at the letter, hardly believing what she was reading. They want me to help organize medical care for the entire territory. According to this, your work with the clinic has impressed some important people in the territorial capital, Tobias said with obvious pride. They're looking for someone who can bridge the gap between formal medical training and frontier practicalities. Grace felt a surge of excitement at the possibilities the commission represented. The chance to help establish proper medical care across Arizona territory to train other physicians in the unique challenges of frontier medicine, to ensure that isolated communities had access to competent health care. It was everything she had dreamed of but never dared to hope might be possible. There's just one problem, Grace said as she considered the implications of accepting such a position. The commission would require extensive travel throughout the territory. I might be away from the ranch for weeks at a time. James set down his tools and moved to stand beside Grace, his expression serious but supportive. Grace, this is exactly the kind of work you were meant to do. You can't let concerns about our personal arrangements hold you back from an opportunity like this. Our personal arrangements happen to be very important to me, Grace replied, reaching out to take James's hand. I don't want to build a career at the expense of our relationship. Then don't, James said simply. Build a career that includes our relationship. Take the commission, do the work that needs to be done, and come home to me whenever you can. Tobias cleared his throat diplomatically. If I might make a suggestion, there's no reason the territorial medical inspector couldn't have a permanent base of operations here at the clinic. Most of the territory's population is within a few days' ride of this location, and the ranch has plenty of room for visiting physicians who might come here for training. Grace looked around the clinic that represented so much hope and possibility, then at the two men who had become her closest friends and partners in the work of building something better than what they had left behind. You're saying I could accept the commission and still make this place my home? I'm saying, James replied with a smile that lit up his storm gray eyes, that you should do whatever will make you happiest and most fulfilled. And if that means becoming the territory's leading medical authority while maintaining your base here with us, then that's what will make work. Grace felt tears of gratitude and joy pricking at her eyes as she realized how completely her life had transformed since arriving in Arizona territory. She had come west as a broken woman, fleeing her past, expecting nothing more than employment and safety. Instead, she had found love, purpose, family, and now the opportunity to contribute to something larger than her own healing. There's something else, Grace said, making a decision that had been forming in her mind for weeks. If I'm going to be working as a territorial official, I think it's time I made my personal situation official as well. James's eyebrows rose in surprise and hope. What are you saying, Grace? I'm saying that I think it's time we got married if you're still interested in having a wife who might occasionally disappear for weeks on territorial medical business. James's response was to lift Grace off her feet and spin her around the clinic room, his laughter echoing off the walls and bringing Miguel running to see what was causing such celebration. Is that a yes? Grace asked breathlessly when James finally set her down. That's a yes to everything, James replied, echoing her words from months earlier. Marriage, medical careers, building something lasting together, all of it. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning with the entire extended ranch family in attendance, along with territorial officials who had traveled from the capital to witness the marriage of their new medical inspector. Grace wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, while James wore his best suit and the look of a man who could hardly believe his good fortune. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher who specialized in frontier weddings, but the vows Grace and James exchanged were their own, written together during long evening conversations about their hopes for their shared future. James Sullivan, Grace said as they stood before their friends and family, with the magnificent Arizona landscape spread out behind them. I promise to love you, and not in spite of your scars, but because they're proof of your strength and survival. I promise to share my life and work with you as an equal partner. And I promise to help you remember every day that you are worthy of love, worthy of happiness, and worthy of all the good things life has to offer. Grace Henley, James replied, his voice strong and clear, despite the emotion that roughened his words. I promise to love you not in spite of your past, but because it led you to me. I promise to support your dreams and ambitions as enthusiastically as you've supported mine. And I promise to help you remember every day that your hands were made for healing, Your heart was made for loving, and your spirit was made for changing the world for the better. When they kissed to seal their marriage, the cheers from their assembled friends and family echoed across the valley, carrying their joy to the red rock formations that had witnessed so much struggle and now bore witness to triumph. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music provided by ranch hands who had hidden musical talents, food contributed by neighboring families, and stories shared by people whose lives had been touched by Grace and James's example of healing and forgiveness. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Miguel stood up to offer a toast to the newlyweds, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed their journey from the beginning. To Grace and Storm, Miguel said, raising his glass in salute, who taught all of us that the war doesn't have to define who we are, that healing is possible, even from the worst wounds, and that love is stronger than any force that tries to divide us. As the celebration continued around them, Grace and James slipped away from the crowd to walk together under the star-filled Arizona sky, talking quietly about their plans for the future and marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect happiness. "Any regrets?" James asked, using the question that had become their private ritual. "Only one," Grace replied with a smile that had become her standard answer. "I regret all the time we wasted thinking we weren't worthy of happiness. But I'm grateful for every moment since we learned better." The years that followed proved that their happiness was built on foundations strong enough to weather any storm. Grace's work as territorial medical inspector took her throughout Arizona Territory, where she established training programs, standardized medical practices, and ensured that even the most isolated communities had access to competent healthcare. James managed their ranch and clinic with the same tactical precision he had once applied to cavalry operations, creating a model of integrated agriculture and medical care that was studied and copied throughout the West. He also served as Grace's unofficial partner in her territorial work, using his knowledge of frontier conditions to help her understand the practical challenges facing isolated communities. Tobias Freeman became the territory's first black deputy marshal, using his position to ensure that law enforcement served all citizens equally, regardless of race or social status. His partnership with James continued to serve as an example of how former enemies could become genuine friends when they shared common values and mutual respect. Miguel recovered completely from his war wound and became the ranch's foreman, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day operations so that Grace and James could focus on their expanding medical and social welfare work. But perhaps their greatest achievement was the family they built together. Not just their own children who grew up in a household where racial equality and gender partnership were taken for granted, but the extended family of people who found refuge and renewal at the ranch that became known throughout the territory as a place where anyone could find healing and acceptance. Grace never forgot her wartime experiences, but she learned to see them as preparation for the work she was truly meant to do, rather than as a source of shame and guilt. Her knowledge of trauma and suffering made her a more effective physician, while her understanding of forgiveness and redemption made her a better counselor to others struggling with their own dark memories. James never forgot Cedar Creek, but he learned to remember it as an example of heroic sacrifice rather than tactical failure. His willingness to accept responsibility for difficult decisions made him an effective leader, while his understanding of loss and survival made him a compassionate supporter of others facing impossible choices. Together, they created something that neither could have achieved alone, a legacy of healing that extended far beyond their individual contributions to encompass an entire philosophy of how former enemies could become partners in building something better than what they had destroyed. Years later, when Grace was an old woman surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew nothing of war but everything about love, she would still smile when visitors asked her about the secret to their lasting happiness and successful partnership. The secret, she would tell them, is understanding that love isn't about finding someone perfect. Love is about finding someone who makes you want to be better than you were, and then spending your life helping each other grow into the people you were meant to become. And in the distance, the red rock formations of Arizona Territory would echo with the laughter of their descendants, carrying forward the legacy of two people who had proven that healing was possible, even from the deepest wounds, and that love truly could triumph over any force that sought to divide the human heart. Grace Henley Sullivan had come west as a broken woman fleeing her past. She remained as a healer who had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others, who found in her example the proof that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to choose love over fear, forgiveness over hatred, and hope over despair. The thunder that had once reminded her of war eventually became simply the sound of approaching rain, bringing life to the desert and washing the world clean for a new beginning. And Grace Sullivan, physician and healer wife and partner, knew that sometimes the storms of life were not meant to destroy, but to clear away what needed to be released so that something better could grow in its place.